chapter we're going to be reading tonight?
You.
Oh, why don't you tell them?
Fine.
What chapter are we reading tonight?
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
To guess. Snowball.
In some. Do you want to tell them what we're reading tonight? We are reading Heart and Soul by Kadir Nelson.
Then we're going to read this.
Yes. I believe we are on chapter 3. Last week we covered slavery. If you guys remember, we talked about slavery. You remember this. We were on chapter 2. This week we are on chapter 3, which is abolition. Just is not law. William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist. I explore slavery in this country because to expose it is to kill it. Frederick Douglass, abolitionist. So I want you guys to think about the abolitionists that we might have talked about in class, or maybe some abolitionists that you might know of. William, do you know of any abolitionists? No? I wonder if Harriet Tubman would be an abolitionist, because she kind of talked about slavery. You're not in the camera, you're cool. If we could think about some abolitionists that we talked about, an abolitionist was somebody who worked really hard to end slavery, like we talked about the Quakers and how they were the very first ones to try to, they very, very originating abolitionists. So while I'm reading this, I want you guys to think in your mind of some people that you might know of that we've talked about in class that tried to end slavery. That's what an abolitionist is. It's a fancy word for somebody trying to end something. Okay, so here we go. Even though it didn't specifically say so, slavery was written into the new Constitution, right along with we the people. The farmers who wrote the Constitution could have ended slavery right then and there if they wanted to, and they even thought about it, but instead they chose to keep it. They thought they needed it. You see, America grew up on slavery. It was like mother's milk to the new country, and it made her grow big and strong. Southern planters had lined their pockets with profits from the slave-grown crops, and northern industries depended on them too. To justify Southern white folks had convinced themselves that black people were fine with being slaves. They were all nuts, or as they would say, touched in the head. Not a one of them would have traded places with us, and since those white gentlemen running the country wouldn't give us our freedom, we decided to take it ourselves. In this book. Pabst Plantation had taught himself to read, which was very dangerous, because if white folks had found out, he would have gotten a sound licking. White folks thought if slaves learned to read or write, they could read or write the Bible for themselves or anti-slavery papers if they got their hands on them, and began to question their master's behavior. They might even be able to communicate with other slaves and begin to communicate with other slaves and anti-slavery folks outside of their plantations. Education is a powerful thing and often made slaves hard to control and likely to run away. So their masters took good care to make sure they remained illiterate. In fact, at the time it was illegal for slaves to read or write. A lot of them learned anyway. They'd trick their young masters into teaching them the alphabet or find spelling book or sneak off to learn it and then teach the other slaves. White folks were right about slaves who learned how to read. That boy from Pabst Plantation eventually ran away to Massachusetts, where he became a great speaker, talking to large crowds of white folks about how terrible it was to be a slave. He also wrote a narrative about his life that made him very famous. Many came to know him as the Lion of Anacostia. Pap knew him as Frederick Douglass. Up north, Douglass joined with other free black folks, former slaves and good white folks who were trying to end slavery. They were called abolitionists because they wanted to abolish slavery. Abolitionists were everywhere, even in the South. They worked with folks like Harriet Tubman to help slaves escape to the North by way of the Underground Railroad. Not a real railroad, but a loose network of safe houses and secret routes. Preaching about the awfulness of slavery was one of the best ways to fight it, and Douglass and Tubman did their best to spread the gospel. They lit fire inside of many a slave to take their freedom. Row to toe. Even though slavery was drying out up north, it was getting stronger in the South. Cotton was the most profitable crop in the country, and plenty of slaves were needed to grow it. To meet the demand for more cotton, tens of thousands of slaves in the northern slave states were marched hundreds of miles on foot out west and down the Mississippi River into the deep South. Pap remembered seeing a new group of them tied together like horses to a wagon, marching down the road past the plantation. New states were being added all the time as Americans started settling the West. Congress would determine whether or not each new state should allow slavery, and it was always a fight. As the country grew in, Frederick Douglass, as a young man, we've all only seen the pictures of Frederick Douglass as an old man with gray hair. Grew in size, so did the tension between the North and the South. Then, in 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which left it up to the settlers of new territories to decide whether or not to allow slavery. The new law allowed slavery to exist above the Mason-Dixon line, the symbolic dividing line between the North and the South, at the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania, which was drawn 34 years prior during the Missouri Compromise. This scared the pants off the anti-slavery folks because the compromise made it so slavery would be limited to the South. But now slavery seemed to be on the move. It put a fire in the bellies of abolition folks all over the Union, including a country lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. Because of it, that fellow decided to run for president. Southern white folks couldn't stand Lincoln. He often spoke out against the spread of slavery, and Southerners were convinced that if he was elected president, it would spell the end of their way of life. It was no wonder why slaves and free black folks took an instant liking to the country lawyer. In him, they saw a chance to put an end to slavery for good. The truth, though, was Lincoln didn't have any intentions of abolishing slavery, and very publicly said as much. But the Southerners didn't believe him. Slaves on Pap's plantation were following the election closely, eavesdropping on white folks talking in the streets and at the dinner table. Election day came and went. Lincoln didn't get a single vote in the South, but won the election anyway, by winning a popular vote in all but one of the northern states. White folks in the South were so spittin' mad, all riled up, that 7 southern states quit the Union, followed by 4 others not long after. The states formed their own country, the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis their president. President Lincoln demanded that they stop all that foolishness and come back to the Union, but they didn't pay him any mind. The South was fixing for a fight, and so Lincoln was fitting to give him one. Chapter 3, we are now on to Chapter 4, Lincoln's War. I want you guys to start thinking about the abolitionists that you might know of. Also, what kind of war do you think is coming up next? We already talked about the American Revolution, and we talked about how that played a role in here. Now, I want you to think about what kind of next war came after that in our history books. Also, the ones that we have talked about in the slave and the black people's point of view on this. So I want you guys to start thinking about that for next week. And good night. Does Tinker want to say good night?
Night.
Tinker says good night. Good night, guys. See you next week. You want to say good night, William?
Mm.